This is a photo of one of the anchors made for the RMS Titanic, a monster of a thing. For the time, around 1910, it was the largest yet made, around 18 feet or 5.5 meters long, and weighing at more than 15 tons. Hingley, the manufacturer, was so proud of their creation they photographed it extensively and paraded it 2 miles from their works to the nearest train station, pulled by around 20 enormous Clydesdales on a heavy-duty cart. Far from being a solid lump of steel, the anchors of ships like Titanic were complicated pieces of technology that relied on a few moving parts to work, and even more complicated pieces of machinery to lower and raise. It begs the question, just what does an anchor do? Well, we all know they're used to hold ships in position when they're not moving. But why? How do they work? Today, we'll take a look at how anchors came to be, how they function, and what they do, and some truly impressive examples that show off the insane scale of maritime engineering. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how ships' anchors work. People have been taking to the open water for thousands of years, and over that time, the boats and the ships that they've used have grown in both size and the amount of technology equipped on board. Sails have given way to steam engines, then eventually they gave way to diesel. Wooden ships were replaced with vessels made of iron and steel. Wireless radio technology allowed vessels crossing the Atlantic to communicate with both other ships and the shore. And today, modern vessels have advanced GPS navigation, safety features, but for all the things that have changed, some things have largely remained the same. All ships need propulsion to make them go, just as they did thousands of years ago. They need anchors to help them stay put. Before we look at how modern anchors work, we need to wind back the clock and look at their history and where they came from, because the truth of how they actually function will probably surprise you, and it's not at all what you think. Exactly how long anchors have been used is a contested topic, but it's hard not to think that from the moment humans first took boats to the water, they figured out they would need a way to keep their stopped craft floating in place. The common theory is that the first anchors were likely developed by early fishermen looking to keep their boats above a promising location. They were probably just rocks fastened with rope. In fact, what are thought to be rock anchors have been found off the Cornish coast in England, dating back from at least the Bronze Age around 3000 BC. If the anchor wasn't big or heavy enough for the boat, then the ancient mariners would often modify them to stop them from skipping over the seafloor, lashing some tree branches to the stone-formed teeth, or flukes, to fasten themselves into the bottom by digging into the mud. Now, although anchors made their appearance in history quite early, the technology to produce iron anchors, similar to more modern ships as we know them, was still a long way off. Alternatively, anchors were made with various combinations of wood, rope, and stone, really anything heavy enough, ranging from bags of sand to lumps of lead. But as boats grew in size, and then eventually became ships, shipwrights knew they would need ever larger anchors to keep their craft in place. The US Naval Institute points out that different anchor types depended on the civilizations that used them. Ancient Egyptians shaped their anchors from elongated stone blocks, with a hole and a channel cut near the top to take the cable, and ancient Arab traders used donut-shaped, ring-stone anchors well into the early medieval age. But in time, ships simply got bigger and bigger. With stone anchors growing in size, they were becoming harder to raise and lower, and even harder to stow on board. Roman, Greek, and eventually Scandinavian shipwrights forged iron anchors. A very fine example of one was found off Scotland, called the priest-side anchor. Crucially, these kinds of ancient anchors did away with solid lumps of material and used distinct components. A long main shaft called the shank, and a curved base featuring distinct flukes or teeth rising up to catch on the ocean floor. Roman designs featured a stock which sat at the top of the shank, or the main shaft of the anchor, and prevented it from lying flat on the sea floor, meaning that no matter which way the anchor fell to the bottom, one of the flukes would be able to dig in. As the decades and the centuries wore on, ships got bigger and bigger. They became taller and bulkier. It meant that there was more windage, or the part of the ship's hull that's exposed and responsible for wind resistance, exerting greater pull on the anchors. The ships, of course, needed much larger anchors because of it. The anchor's shape had changed very little. These now much larger anchors were difficult to handle. They were awkward to stow, so they had to be lashed to the outside of the hull. Anchors couldn't just be thrown overboard by hand, though. They'd need a special, dedicated piece of equipment to haul them up once they were finished. Enter the windlass, a simple rotating drum with a ratchet that made sure as the drum rotated it could take the strain and weight of the anchor without dropping it. Of course, the only way to turn the drum was human labour. Teams of men needed to put their backs into the brutal task, heaving against bars inserted into the windlass's drum. And in the golden age of sail, the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, sailors were well accustomed to trudging slowly around the windlass as the anchor cable clank, clank, clanked and lifted the massive anchor up. The story of the anchor's evolution is what we would probably now refer to as feature creep, because they just got so big and heavy that they kept providing fresh engineering challenges to shipwrights and naval architects. One issue had always been stowage. The old styles of anchor, with their big curved flukes and large stock, were bulky and extremely awkward to stow. One solution came with a redesign, when the stock of the anchor was redesigned so it could pivot onto the same plane as the flukes, which allowed the anchor to be finally stored flat against the hull. This design change was a huge success, but another crucial redesign came in the 19th century, when the French firm C.M. Martin & Sons came up with an anchor featuring a short fixed stock and arms alongside that pivoted out through 30 degrees. Now, this pivoting action meant that both of the anchor's flukes would be buried instead of just one, improving grip on the seabed, but also reducing the risk the ship's cable could get caught on the anchor itself and pull it out while the ship was pushed around by wind or waves above. The Martin anchor was really a spiritual predecessor to the types of stockless anchors that still exist today. In 1821, the stockless anchor changed the game entirely. Its operation was very simple. Its recovery, a relative breeze. It could sit flush against the hull of a steamer. With its development came the steam-powered windlass. Now, poor crews were given a break from their back-breaking labour by the new machines that could haul in anchor cable with the anchor at the end through the sheer power of steam. Anchors haven't really changed very much since. You can still find stockless anchors on most large ships around the world. But actually anchoring a ship is a difficult and delicate process that needs all the skill of a well-trained crew. Here's how they do it. The first thing to consider is when and if an anchor is needed at all. Alongside wharfs or docks, ships don't actually need to anchor, they can just tie up to big bollards on the shore, and they're held in place that way. But sometimes situations require a ship to stay put away from the docks in shallow bays or inlets. Take, for example, the bizarre series of events in 2021, when the cargo ship Ever Given ran aground in the Suez Canal. The resulting blockage caused a huge backlog of ships which all needed to deploy their anchors and wait patiently off port said. So, the truth is that anchors by themselves don't actually hold the ship in place. Shocking, I know. If you dig an anchor into the sea floor with a small amount of cable, the ship's movements above can just snap the links and set it free or drag the anchor. Actually, it's the anchor cable itself, a vast, heavy beast of a thing that is paid out and holds the ship in place, and the anchor acts as a weighted end to hold the cable down. Anchor chains are impressive in and of themselves, and far from being just a long metal chain, there's actually quite a bit of thought that goes into them. Modern anchor chains are made up of lengths of individual sections of chain called shots, around 27.5 meters or 90 feet long. Different sized ships need different lengths of chain, and therefore greater or lesser numbers of shot. The largest could carry up to 770 meters, more than 3,500 feet. That's 28 shots of anchor cable, and all that length really has only a little to do with the depth of anchoring, because typically ships can only anchor in fairly shallow water anyway. It actually has a lot more to do with the actual force required to hold the ship in place. Your largest tankers or cruise ships will need a huge amount of anchor chain, many shots worth, for example, to be paid out, so their massive drag on the sea floor will hold the ship in place. Crews will deploy a length of cable between 3 and 7 times the depth of the water they're anchoring in, to ensure there's enough cable on the sea floor to do its thing. The anchor at the other end of the line will act as an immense weight to make sure the cable doesn't move at all from their original anchoring position. It's a clever setup that moves away from how anchors were used in the early days, even though they're crucial to the operation of the overall system. But it's a system that needs constant monitoring. Too much cable, and the ship will drift farther away, and it could exert too much pressure on the anchor below, risking dragging it along the sea floor. But too little cable, and you'd have the same problem, or worse, because a short jolt could even break a link and leave the anchor behind. The huge amounts of anchor chain are stored in the bow of the ship beneath the windlass in a kind of giant tank called the chain locker. When the anchors aren't in use, they fit snugly in a hawse, a kind of reinforced bay in the hull, usually made of solid steel much thicker than the hull plating around it, to protect from the anchor's flukes when they're brought back up by the windlass. The anchor's shank rises up through the hawse pipe to just below the level of the forecastle deck at the bow, where the chain rises through a stopper or a riding pawl. Now, obviously, securing an anchor weighing up to 20 tons or more in place is no easy task, which is why the riding pawl is crucial because it takes up the enormous strain and keeps the anchor in check. The windlass itself features a brake too, and the links of the anchor's chain align with grooves in the windlass's drum so that as the windlass spins, so the chain goes in or out. To deploy the anchor, gravity does most of the work. Lashings are removed, the riding pawl is lifted, and the brakes are let go. The anchor's weight is allowed to free fall, and as it goes, it takes the chain with it. It's an awe-inspiring sight to see that much metal moving that quickly. Once the anchor is dug in below, the windlass can be engaged to actually pay more cable out. Remember, different lengths are required for different ships, and the different shots on the chain can be color-coded to help crews know just how much has been paid out. Retrieving the anchor is a matter of reversing the action of the windlass so it begins to wind the cable in. Eventually, the pressure on the anchor will dislodge it and lift it up and out before it comes up into the hawse hole and the pipe, fitting snugly in place once again. To help extend the life of ship and anchor, some vessels feature hawse-mounted washing systems which flush water down and remove all the mud and sediment from both the anchor and the pipe. Crews also need to be careful when anchoring their ships because sometimes, counterintuitively, too many anchors can lead to disaster. Deploying a bow and stern anchor, for example, will certainly hold the ship tightly in place, but if a bad blow comes on and the weather shifts, the ship will not be able to swing with the wind, meaning it would be at risk of listing, and smaller vessels like yachts could even be capsized and sunk. Anchors have often been used to hold ships in place in bad weather though, while they shelter in shallow waters. In fact, Titanic's sister Britannic faced a very bad storm off Naples that saw her deploy her third central anchor, the biggest and heaviest of the main three, so that she could safely ride it out. In extreme depths, where using a standard anchor is just not possible, specialized anchors are available instead. The sea anchor is a device that slows the vessel's progress through the water in situations that might need it. By creating drag, sea anchors act as a kind of brake. Deploying one in bad weather can actually help prevent some ships from broaching when big waves come from behind and cause the ship to ride like a surfboard, turning violently around thanks to their hull shape and ending up helpless on broadside to be battered by the sea. Modern sea anchors look more like a paratrooper's parachute, with a long cable attached to the parachute body from the bow. Another kind of anchor is the kind used for maneuvering in port. Kedge anchors are relatively small, and when they're deployed, they can provide a fixed pivot point for the ship if maneuvering is difficult or tight. You won't really find them on passenger ships today, but they were very popular on big ships in the early 20th century. In fact, Board of Trade regulations required British passenger ships to carry a few relative to their size. Titanic, for example, had to carry two, one which weighed a full ton stowed on her bow, and the other smaller half-ton anchor at her stern rail. The truth is that the presence of these anchors on ships like Titanic was purely to satisfy the laws which had become outdated by the turn of the 20th century, and some shipbuilders knew it. Researcher Bill Sauter pointed out that Lusitania's kedge anchor was kept all the way down in her number 2 cargo hold, hardly a convenient place. Of course, the great Oceanliner's main anchors were enormous in their scale. Queen Mary, for instance, only had 2 anchors, although they were absolutely massive, weighing around 16 tons, standing 18 feet tall. A third anchor was also actually kept as a spare in Southampton during her career. Her modern-day equivalent, Queen Mary 2, has even bigger ones, a trio of 23-ton monsters and more than 100 tons of chain. Of course, the windlass has changed a lot too. No longer steam-powered, modern examples are electric instead. So, that's why anchors look the way they do and how they work. They're clever pieces of engineering that do a lot to make mariners' lives much easier. Without them, ships would struggle to stay put in bad weather, using their engines constantly to try to hover in place in a futile battle against wind and sea. At the start of the video, I mentioned Titanic's anchor at Hingley. This was the massive central anchor that was so big it needed a dedicated crane to lift it out and over the side of the ship. Hingley, the manufacturers based in Netherton in the West Midlands, had been making chain and anchors since the early 1800s, but the order for Titanic was, for the time, their biggest and best work. They supplied Olympic and Britannic too, and they were clearly very proud of it. That huge, central, 16-ton anchor went down with the ship, and sits today, still lashed in place at the very tip of the bow, where it was first installed. You know, one of the really interesting things about classic ocean liners like the Titanic or the Queen Mary is just how much of the ship sits underwater. This is known as the ship's draft, the distance from the waterline to the keel, the ship's backbone. Queen Mary had an incredible 39-foot or almost 12-meter draft. That's about the height of a 3-story building. But one thing you might have noticed in pictures and paintings is the striking colour, red. We all know, even subconsciously, that ships seem to always be painted red below the waterline. But why? I mean, ships exist at sea, why not paint it blue or green or something nautical? Is it to hide rust or some kind of weird ages-old tradition that's still followed blindly today? Well, it's an interesting story, or at least I think it is. So sit back and relax as I explain why ships are painted red. Ships sail on the sea. I know, it's a shocking revelation. It's a very unstable and unpredictable environment. It's actually more unpredictable than Melbourne's weather. If you're from here, you'll understand that one. Waves can run stories tall and strip the paint from bare steel. Salt crusts and deposits rusts anything that isn't painted and turns it brown. Seawater rots wood and fabric. It's a harsh, unfriendly environment, but a select few mad humans have been going out to the sea for centuries. The mariner, a strange specimen of humankind, seems to enjoy this bizarre kind of lifestyle, so when they set out to sea like their ancestors did back in the 1500s through to the 1800s, their ships were fairly simple. They relied on the wind to get their speed, but they were made out of timber. Fairly dense and reliable timber too, like oak, teak or mahogany, but old-timey shipbuilders encountered a few unique problems. See, getting across the ocean as quickly as possible was a big deal in the centuries before steam engines and airplanes, so every single bit of speed that could be squeezed out of a ship's design was paramount. Pretty early on, sailors realized that ships sitting in harbors waiting to be loaded or overhauled began to gather unwanted inhabitants. Yes, of course, there were rats, but below the waterline, something strange was happening. Seaweed, barnacles, and thick marine growth, it began to build up on the ship's hull. Aesthetically speaking, nobody really cared, but it had a huge impact on the ship's speed. With clumps of marine growth on the hull, the ship couldn't as easily slice through the water. It would slow down. So ships had to regularly be scraped clean of these unwanted hitchhikers. It was a problem back in 1600, and it remains a problem today. It's hilarious to think that with all these years of technological advancement, even in the golden age of the Oceanliner, the mammoth luxury ships like Queen Mary had to be regularly docked and scraped clean. But in the days of sail, it wasn't just marine growth that had to be stopped, the ship itself had to be protected from being eaten away. Shipworms are a nasty little thing, technically a kind of mollusk that eats ships, specifically the wood that was used to build them. Back in the day, sailing ships were made of timber, and over time, these little critters would burrow in and do some serious damage. The ancient Greeks had this issue. Their fancy wooden ships were being eaten away below the waterline, so they started attaching lead plates for protection, but by the days of sail, lead in contact with iron bolts would cause galvanic corrosion, so something else had to be used. The answer was copper, and sailing ships had thin copper plates nailed onto their wooden hulls. The copper could be easily replaced, and the ships would still need to be dry docked for scraping to get all those nasty barnacles off, but at least now shipworms had been mostly defeated. And that's why, in a lot of paintings and pictures, ships from the golden age of sail either have a golden colour at their waterline or kind of like a milky green colour, because as copper ages in water, it turns green. Nowadays, shipwrecks from that period often have their wood long gone, eaten away by sea creatures and bacteria, and all that's left behind is the copper sheathing that once would have protected it. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked as usual. By the time iron and steel-hulled ships had come along, the copper sheathing wasn't necessary anymore because shipworm can't burrow into metal. But using metal hulls presented new and exciting challenges for ships builders and operators. For one thing, marine growth was still a thing, but now ships were getting bigger and bigger, and scraping them would have to be a less common occurrence. Not only that, but steel and iron rust. They corrode in water, which means an unprotected hull would be eaten away and the ship could sink. The answer was very simple, and any ex-Navy personnel watching this can confirm that the old adage is, if it's rusted, you paint it. But paint it with what? You can't just use something like a house paint, that stuff would be stripped right off by the water. No, a special kind of thick protective paint would need to be used, and one was developed that could serve two special purposes. And guess what colour it was? It was back in 1865 when a chap named Heinrich Ratjen from Germany patented a paint formula that was designed specifically to protect the underside of ships' hulls. By this point, iron-hulled ships were everywhere, and a number of formulas had been put forward to varying degrees of success, as many as 300 of them. But Ration's mixture would be in use from 1865 for decades, and it wasn't just any ordinary old kind of paint, because its 10th ingredient was arsenic. Ration's formula used these ingredients: wood alcohol or methylated spirits, shellac, thick turpentine, linseed oil, common rosin, which is a kind of resin, gallipot, which is another kind of resin, tar spirit, tallow, Venetian red, remember this one, arsenic, zinc oxide, and mercury oxide. Now, those are some pretty serious ingredients. Using shellac and two kinds of resin meant that the paint would be insanely hardy once allowed to dry and set in place, and the arsenic and mercury oxide would make the paint toxic to marine life. Barnacles and marine growth wouldn't accumulate because they'd be poisoned. Over time, the paint would need to be touched up, of course, but it would mean ships' undersides would need to be scraped way less often. It's that 9th ingredient, though, Venetian red, that gave the formula its colour. Venetian red is a pigment, the colour of paint, that dates back to ancient times for one simple reason: it's naturally occurring. It's made from iron oxide that you can find in rocks. Because of that, it is insanely abundant and crazy cheap to make. It's been used in everything from cave paintings to medieval art. In the 1600s, the British Army began to use it to dye their jackets for easy identification in battle. This was the birth of the infamous redcoats, a tradition that continues to this day. Venetian red is extremely durable. The whole point of the paint formula was durability, after all. The ships would be expected to go many months in between dry docking and repainting, so the paint had to last. The formula, the mixture of durable pigments and oxides, resulted in a red paint that protected the ships from corrosion and marine growth and greatly increased their durability, and this special paint was called antifouling. So now you have a striking colour that is born out of necessity, but pretty soon it becomes tradition. Ships' hulls just become red. Some companies even begin to use it as a branding tool. Despite the hardiness of the paint, the waterline around a ship is an area of a lot of action. Tugboats, lighters, and tenders, they all bump and scrape along the ship's hull. Very often, in the golden days of Oceanliners, that area ended up looking like a real mess. The Cunard line didn't like this about their ships in the late 1800s. They wanted theirs to look the smartest in the world, so they introduced a thing called a boot topping. A boot topping is an added layer of paint in any colour that sits on top of the antifouling because it looks good. Antifouling on ships isn't a bright red, it's a kind of dull, rusty colour. But Cunard Line wanted their ships to look special, so they introduced a bright red boot topping with a thin white line. On photos of their ships in dry dock, you can just see where the antifouling ends and the boot topping begins. They emphasise this in their postcards and their posters with bright red waterlines and smart Cunard red funnels. The ships look very smart indeed. This is a tradition that Cunard continues to this day. Queen Mary 2, the only operational ocean liner in the world, sails with a bright red boot topping sitting on top of her antifoul. Other ships have used some strange boot topping colours. At one point, the Queen Elizabeth II had a blue boot topping, which the public hated so much that Cunard Line changed it right back to red. In the 50s and 60s, Orient Line's ships used a green boot topping. Hell, most cruise ships today show a blue boot topping at the waterline. You might think the whole underside is blue, but it's just for looks. Get the cruise ship in dry dock, and most of the time you'll find it's all an illusion, and the underside is that same old dull red. Of course, nowadays there are so many pigments and choices that a ship's antifoul can really be painted any colour. But using a naturally occurring pigment like Venetian red is the cheapest option, and after all, why break with tradition? Of course, using arsenic in modern day antifoul is generally frowned upon. There are a whole host of biocides used in antifouling of modern ships, poisons designed to kill marine growth before it can grow on the hull. Occasionally though, a biocide is deemed too harmful and it's banned. This year, a biocide called cybutrine was banned in ships because studies found that it was building up and was, surprise surprise, extremely toxic to marine animals and organisms. Nowadays, organic biocides are preferred, but it's shocking what we've put into the ocean in the quest to prevent our ships from rusting. Everything from heavy metals to lead and arsenic to the pesticide DDT. So why are ships red? Well, because it's cheap, it's durable, and now it's a tradition. After all, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Lifeboats. You've probably seen them dozens of times on ships without giving them too much thought, but in an emergency, they'd be your best friend. These little guys, and to be fair, some actually aren't that little, are the last lifeline for those in danger at sea. Today, we have stringent controls on the number and type of lifeboats that ships can have. From the massive, heavy passenger carrying boats from cruise ships, to the crash-launching, rapid-release boats found on cargo vessels. How do these clever machines work? Well, today we'll take a look at the history of lifeboats, from their days as simple, open-top wooden boats to the advanced pieces of technology that they are today. So when do mariners first start using lifeboats? Well, it seems like the obvious thing to do. If your ship runs into trouble, then you'll need to get away somehow. But the truth is, ships' boats weren't always originally focused on saving lives at sea. Ships of the 17th century, such as those belonging to the Dutch East India Company, carried smaller boats that could be used in emergencies, but these weren't lifeboats in the modern sense, rather small boats intended for various uses, including ship-to-shore transport. There were many different kinds of boats for lots of different jobs, ranging from cutters, which were broad and large for transporting goods from shore to ship, all the way to gigs, long and fast for quickly rowing the captain ashore. Back then, if your ship was lost at sea in combat or in a storm, very little thought was given to salvation or rescue. It was a foregone conclusion that ships lost in a storm would be lost with their crews as well. The ship was all they had. The real impetus for the development of the lifeboat came in the 18th century, particularly in Britain, where shipwrecks along the coast prompted efforts to improve maritime safety. In 1789, Lionel Lucan patented the first design for an unsinkable rescue boat, featuring a wooden frame covered with copper and buoyant materials like cork. The idea was for these boats to be based in stations ashore, where wrecks often happened, manned by dedicated crews who would row out if disaster struck and rescue as many people as they could. Now, the new type of vessel was given a new name, the lifeboat. Although Lucan's design was a significant step forward, it was actually Henry Greathead who was often credited with constructing the first modern lifeboat in 1790. His boat, named Original, featured an iron keel, watertight compartments, and cork for buoyancy. Crucially, it was also self-righting, an essential feature for a boat designed to operate in rough seas. If the boat was flipped in heavy waves, it would, in theory, turn itself upright again. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution, established in the UK in 1824, played a pivotal role in advancing lifeboat design and deployment, saving countless lives over the years. The lifeboat crews were very brave, and they participated in many impressive rescues. But soon, naval planners began to cotton onto the idea of taking the design features of those shore-based lifeboats and including them on the boats carried by larger ships at sea. With the adoption of passenger steamships in the mid-1800s, the size and passenger complement of those ships began to steadily increase. Fare-paying passengers expected a layer of safety. In those days, going to sea meant you were taking a gamble because often ships would never reach their destination and even simply disappear at sea. The appearance of lifeboats aboard ships at least presented a veil of hope for rescue. Throughout the 19th century, several innovations improved lifeboat design and function. Now, one notable invention was the self-bailing lifeboat, which featured mechanisms that removed water that entered the boat, thus increasing its survivability in heavy seas. Now, lifeboats then were typically wooden, big, and heavy, 30 feet or more long, capable of holding some 40 to 70 people. They had big buoyancy tanks fitted in to help with the flotation, but in a heavy, raging sea, the boats were still as good as sunk. They were open-topped, easily flooded or capsized. Not only that, but the way lifeboats were lowered from clunky cranes called radial davits meant that they might not even reach the water safely in the first place. Now, even worse, ships of the time infamously carried fewer lifeboats than the total number of passengers and crew on board. Now, this came to the attention of the public in 1912. The sinking of RMS Titanic marked a watershed moment for lifeboats and maritime safety regulations. The disaster highlighted the insufficient number of lifeboats on board the ship and led to the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, in 1914. The simple truth was that ships had just exploded in size and the regulations had not kept up at all. SOLAS established strict lifeboat requirements for all ships, including the provision of enough lifeboats or life-saving capacity for all passengers and crew, lifeboat drills, and other safety measures. Throughout the 20th century, lifeboat design continued to evolve. Finally, the boats shifted from wood to steel and aluminium, making them much more durable and easier to launch. But it also meant they could grow in size. In 1912, one of Titanic's lifeboats could carry about 65 people. By 1936, Queen Mary's boats could carry 145. And not only that, but the old radial davit cranes were finally gone. These were rickety and relied on crew members to let the rope lines or falls out by hand, resulting in a jerky, uneven release for the boat. Not so fun when passengers were swinging 6 or more stories above the ocean's surface. The gravity davit was a clever device that could actually store the lifeboats up on deck, easily swing out, and then use gravity and electric winches to smoothly and automatically lower the boats over the side. Critically, lifeboats began to receive their own propulsion. First steam engines and then diesel, so they could easily motor to safety, and even wireless radio sets so that they could communicate with the outside world. Old wooden-top lifeboats, if they had got away from a sinking ship, often went days or even weeks before a rescue ship happened to stumble across them, if they ever did at all. The new technological developments meant that lifeboats stood a greater and greater chance of being discovered. Today, lifeboats have changed a lot, and they're actually part of a larger, comprehensive life-saving system, which includes life rafts, personal flotation devices, and sophisticated emergency and evacuation procedures. Modern ships' lifeboats are really marvels of design in and of themselves, reflecting decades and decades of lessons learnt the hard way. They're built to withstand extreme conditions, ensuring the safety of occupants until rescue. The design features and construction of these lifeboats are governed by those rigorous international regulations, including those sent forth by SOLAS. Modern lifeboats are commonly constructed from robust, lightweight materials like fiberglass reinforced plastic, FRP, or aluminium. Now, these materials are chosen for their durability, their resistance to corrosion, and their ability to withstand the harsh marine environment. FRP in particular offers excellent strength-to-weight ratios and is totally safe from the corrosive effects of saltwater and the harsh marine environment. Aluminium, while also resistant to corrosion, provides a lighter alternative, which can be crucial for the overall weight of the lifeboat and its launching system. Now, the construction of a modern lifeboat is a meticulous process that involves assembling multiple layers of materials to create the hull, installing the internal components and systems, and rigorous testing to ensure it all meets maritime safety standards. In fact, each lifeboat is like its own little ship, and quality control is paramount, with each lifeboat undergoing extensive inspections and even sea trials before being deemed ready for installation. Some of the key areas of the way modern lifeboats are designed and built can be broken down into these facets. First of all, buoyancy and stability. The lifeboats are designed with built-in buoyancy, either through the use of buoyant materials within the hull or through watertight compartments and tanks that can prevent sinking even if part of the hull is breached. Stability is a critical design consideration, with many lifeboats capable of righting themselves if they're capsized. Second of all, they feature an enclosed structure. To protect occupants from the elements, modern lifeboats are often fully enclosed. Now, this design feature is crucial for survival in extreme weather conditions, providing shelter from wind, rain, and sea spray, but enclosures also offer protection against hazards like fire or falling objects in the event of an industrial accident at sea. Third of all is the safety and survival equipment. Ships' lifeboats are equipped with all manner of essential survival gear. They're like a floating Swiss Army knife. Lifeboats contain supplies like fresh water, food rations, first aid kits, thermal protective aids, and seasickness bags, but they're also fitted with navigation and communication devices like GPS, VHF radios, and even sometimes radar reflectors, or emergency positioning indicating radio beacons or EPIRBs to aid in rescue operations. Fourth of all is the capacity and seating arrangements. Now, the overall capacity of a lifeboat is actually calculated based off of simple mathematics based around the number of people on board the main vessel, and this is all regulated, of course, by SOLAS regulations. Now, seating is designed to maximize space while also ensuring the safety and comfort of the occupants. Because of the lightweight, strong modern materials we have access to, lifeboats have become much larger and therefore more stable and safe. Queen Mary II's lifeboats can carry some 150 passengers each in much greater safety than her predecessors' boats. Fifth of all are the launch and recovery systems. Lifeboats are equipped with launching systems designed for quick and safe deployment. Now, these can include gravity davits, freefall systems for rapid deployment, we'll get back to that in a minute, and recovery systems that allow the lifeboat to be safely hoisted back onto the ship after use. Now, I mentioned earlier that the gravity davit had greatly improved the lowering procedures for ships' boats back in the 1930s, Well, it was so influential that modern passenger ships still use them. Constructed typically from high-strength steel or aluminium, gravity davits are engineered to withstand the harsh marine environment and the dynamic loads experienced during launch. Now, this is no mean feat because a fully loaded ship's lifeboat, like the 150-person boats from Queen Mary II, can weigh up to 24 US tons. Now, the davits consist of immensely strong arms that can hold the lifeboat safely stowed in place while docked or at sea, and then a winch system with brakes that can control the descent of the lifeboat into the water when it's required. The winch ensures that the lifeboat can be lowered smoothly and at a controlled speed, even in adverse sea conditions or against the listing of a sinking ship. But in addition to lowering lifeboats, gravity davits are designed for efficient retrieval, allowing lifeboats to be hoisted back onto the ship easily after use. Now, this is accomplished through a manual or powered winch system which pulls the lifeboat back into its stowed position, ready for future deployment. This is really important because today, on passenger ships, the lifeboats are used for a special dual purpose, ferrying passengers ashore on excursions. If the ship can't dock, passengers will board the lifeboats, called tenders, which will actually run them safely to their destination and back again. This gives passengers the rare opportunity to see a modern ship's lifeboats in action. But the gravity davit can take time and care to lower away successfully. Now, this isn't a problem on big passenger ships that would take considerable time to sink. But on bulk carriers and tankers, it presents a problem. These monsters of the deep have very little margin for buoyancy. Loaded down with all that dead weight, in an emergency they could sink in just minutes, leaving absolutely no time at all to ready and lower the lifeboats. A series of tragic losses led to the introduction of a special kind of emergency boat, the free-fall lifeboat. Free-fall lifeboats are constructed with a robust, reinforced structure capable of withstanding the hard impact of hitting the water from a significant height without compromising the boat's integrity or the safety of its occupants. They're typically made from the same high-strength materials like fiberglass, reinforced plastic, or aluminium, and the hull is designed with a streamlined shape to facilitate a smooth and stable launch when the boat free falls into the water. The interior of a free-fall lifeboat is equipped with shock-absorbing seating and safety harnesses to protect passengers during the launch. The essence of the free-fall lifeboat's functionality lies in its radical launch mechanism. Instead of being slowly lowered with davits, a free-fall lifeboat is essentially released from a ramp and literally free falls into the sea. Now, this launch system consists of a launching ramp, which is inclined at an angle to the water, and a release mechanism that holds the lifeboat in place at the top of the ramp. When an emergency evacuation is necessary, the crew and passengers board the lifeboat, secure themselves safely in their seats, and close the watertight door behind them. The coxswain, or the person in charge of navigating and operating the lifeboat, then activates a release brake, causing the lifeboat to slide quickly down the ramp and drop into the water in seconds, away from the ship or platform. And one of the key features of the freefall boat is its self-righting capability. The lifeboat might enter the water upside down. Its design will allow it to right itself automatically, ensuring that it's always in the correct orientation. Additionally, the lifeboat's fully enclosed, providing protection against fire, smoke, high seas, and other extreme conditions. Operating a free-fall boat requires specific training and regular drills to ensure that crew members are familiar with the unusual procedures and can execute them quickly and efficiently. Now, obviously, it's a bone-jarring ride for occupants, and probably not one I'd be willing to do for fun. But in dire situations where seconds count, it's the difference between life and death. Now, it might surprise you to know that modern-day passenger ships only require fully enclosed lifeboats for about 75% of the ship's company. The remaining 25% are tended to by life rafts and inflatables. In fact, ships are fitted with special automatically inflatable rafts that will deploy as soon as the ship sinks around them. Over the years, the primary function of lifeboats has remained unchanged: to provide a safe means of evacuating people from a ship in distress. Now, this includes not only passengers and crew, but also, in some cases, survivors of other disasters at sea. Today, lifeboats are big, impressive pieces of technology, but they're not immune to danger. If a ship's list to one side during a sinking exceeds 15 or 20 degrees, it could become difficult or even impossible to lower the boats at all. Fortunately, modern safety features like radar and advanced navigation systems have lessened the need for lifeboats at all, but passengers can rest assured that if they ever need them, modern ships' lifeboats are more than equipped to handle the job. Ships have things that just make them ships. Funnels and towering smokestacks, tall masts, cluttered ventilators, wooden decks, and then the ever-present porthole. The imagery is iconic. When lit at night, they look like stars draped across the night sky. What about the image of portholes dipping below the waterline in James Cameron's Titanic? Certainly one of the most famous and ominous shots in the film. It might be easy to overlook portholes and take them for granted, much like we might do windows on our houses. But portholes play much more than just an aesthetic role on any ship. From providing critical light and air to aiding in escapes during emergency scenarios, portholes are clever bits of kit that are still made for ships across the world, even though their history goes back hundreds of years. Today, let's take a look at, and not through, portholes. How they work, where they came from, and how they were used on the world's most famous liners. This is the story of the humble but mighty porthole. Portholes haven't quite been around as long as ships and boats have, because after all, back in history, it would have taken quite some time for them to be big enough to even need portholes in the first place. But their history still dates back hundreds of years. Early shipbuilders faced a problem. They needed, in some cases, to put holes in the sides of their ships. The only problem is that holes in ships have historically proven, well, problematic. So how could you make a hole in a ship that's also watertight? Portholes, also sometimes called side scuttles, and side lights in some cases, did not get their name because they were on the port side of the ship. So while there are portholes, there's no such thing as starboard holes. They actually got their name from the French word for door, porte, which gives us a clue as to the role early versions of portholes originally played. It's thought that the precursor to portholes first appeared in shipbuilding between the 15th and 16th centuries. Simply put, as guns got bigger and heavier, mounting them to the deck high up above the waterline was a dangerous proposition. They could impact the stability or top heaviness of the vessel, and it made for a crowded weather deck or forecastle deck during combat. Instead, shipwrights around the 16th century began to fit small doors on the hulls of their ships so guns could poke through during battle and then be covered over when they weren't in use. King Henry VIII, an avid supporter of the Navy and England's naval power at large, wanted to equip his warships with guns so large they could not be easily stored on deck of the forecastle or the after castle. Henry's flagship and pride and joy was the Mary Rose, a heavily armed carrack sailing ship of about 500 tons, and fielding around 80 or 90 guns, making her a true superweapon of the time. The secret to her immense firepower were the gun ports. When the weather was bad, or the guns weren't required, the holes in the ship could be closed with a door. The system was clearly not a perfect one though. Mary Rose was caught in a strong gust that heeled her over and brought her overburdened and top-heavy hull hard onto its side, allowing water to roar through the open ports and sink the ship. As naval architects refined their plans for ships equipped with gun ports through the 17th and 18th centuries, ships became generally more stable and less likely to be sunk because of their open ports. But even so, crews knew to shut their gun ports in big seas even as late as the 19th century, when large waves meant smaller ships of the line couldn't open their doors for combat for risk of flooding, even in the presence of the enemy. Now, aside from providing convenient aiming points for guns, these gun ports also came with a probably unintended, huge benefit: fresh air. Ships' holds in the days of wood-hulled sailing ships were dark, dank places crawling with rats. Without running water or flushing toilets, ships simply stank as their crews, sometimes numbering into the hundreds, slept crammed into hammocks and ate below decks. The introduction of opening gun ports meant that crews on the gun deck could swing the doors open if the weather was right and let glorious fresh air and light in. It was a huge boost to morale and even health. But gun ports are a far cry from the round portholes we know today, and exactly where these came from is a little bit of a mystery. We know portholes became widespread on ships in the 1800s, only relatively recently when you think about it, because the technology required to mass produce them only became widespread in the early 19th century. Portholes, both then and now, consisted of a few pretty basic parts. They're usually constructed of a big circular frame or shell, made of bronze or brass, very heavy duty with holes cut in so they can be bolted or riveted directly to the ship's side. The most simple kinds of porthole, those only needed to let light in, simply had thick glass cut into a circle and mounted inside the frame, held in place with big brass screws, and then the entire assembly, which could weigh as much as 40 kilograms, that's around 100 pounds, was aligned with a hole cut into the hull and then secured in place with the rivets or the bolts. But some portholes were designed to open. These featured a separate pivoting frame with the glass in that could be tightly shut against the rest of the porthole's frame with thick screws called dogs. At the top or the bottom of the frame, a huge hinge could swing the porthole open or shut as the user needed. These changed the game because they let in light and fresh air. From this very simple arrangement, a dazzling array of porthole types were designed and put into practice, including those that pivoted open sideways to funnel fresh air in at high speeds, we'll talk about those later, to those that stayed shut but used clever float-based systems to allow fresh air in, even in rough seas. Many lower down in ships' hulls featured deadlights, big circular covers that lowered down over the glass and locked in place. That way, if the glass, thick as it was, shattered in a storm, then the porthole remained watertight. Now, in the early days of implementing portholes, ships were designed so that they were arranged where they were needed the most, usually below decks, where fresh air and light were absolutely paramount. Now, this is notably the case with vessels like the Great Britain from 1845, when passenger comfort and health was given some serious technological consideration. But as time went on, ship owners knew that outside cabins with a porthole could be sold at a premium, versus the inside cabins, which had no natural air and light, not dissimilar to today's world where cruise ships charge a premium for balcony cabins. Inside cabins were, and still are today, the cheapest you could get. But finally, shipbuilders had a way to get beautiful daylight streaming into spaces in ships that would normally be shrouded in darkness. Portholes became ubiquitous and their shape is instantly recognizable. But it's important to note that portholes aren't round just to keep with tradition or pay homage. That iconic shape has real technical and scientific advantages. A ship on the water, a submarine underneath it, an aircraft at cruising altitude, or even a space station floating high in outer space are all subjected to extreme pressure in one way or another. Fortunately, round objects like portholes are very good at dispersing that pressure evenly. A conventional window shape, like a square or a rectangle, would have stress concentrated on its corners if it was put under any serious pressure. Now, a circular window, or a porthole, is able to disperse the pressure evenly without giving any one area a chance for the pressure to concentrate and cause a failure. Not only that, but by making the glass extremely thick, portholes are very heavily reinforced despite the fact their main component is made of a typically fragile material, glass. To that end, porthole glass can be a few inches thick. This natural strength is why you see portholes being used on all kinds of vessels, not just ships. Submarines, for example, use them as well. Famously, Alvin, the manned submersible that took Dr. Robert Ballard and his team to the wreck of Titanic, has a few portholes to allow eyes-on viewing despite being almost 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers below the surface. When extreme conditions call for it, the glass, called the port light in portholes, can be replaced with a high-tech and pressure-resistant material like acrylic or even quartz. Alvin's portholes are made from acrylic plexiglass, and similar portholes on the Russian Mir submersibles are 20 centimeters or 8 inches wide, but 18 centimeters or 7 inches thick. Aircraft use round windows for the same reason, even though some earlier aircraft used rectangular windows with rounded corners. Aboard the International Space Station, you'll find portholes too. The Cupola, a module made for observing the Earth, monitoring spacewalks, and checking on space shuttle arrivals and departures, has 7 portholes made from fused silica and borosilicate glass. This high-tech material allows observers to see through it while being protected from solar radiation and the extreme temperature changes that frequently occur in outer space. It's amazing to think that what had begun as a way to get guns poking out the side of a galleon in the 15th century resulted in windows floating in space. Now, back at sea, portholes could provide not just fresh air and light, they could also provide a means of escape in a pinch, even if this was really just an afterthought. Now, tragically, some were simply made too small for a reasonably sized human to squeeze through. In fact, the smallest used aboard Titanic, for example, were just 9 inches or 22 centimeters wide. Now, there are all kinds of horror stories of people being stuck during ship sinkings that are way too horrible for me to really mention here. So instead, I'll give you a nicer anecdote. When the cruise ship Laconia caught on fire in 1963, passengers were able to squeeze through their portholes and they were lifted to safety by brave crew members dangling over the side from ropes. Laconia had been designed originally as the Dutch liner Johan van Oldenbarneveld, serving the long-distance route to the Dutch East Indies. And to cope with the heat, her portholes were very generously proportioned, a design choice that saved more than a handful of lives the night she caught alight. But just as on the Mary Rose, portholes presented clear and present danger to ships if they weren't carefully operated. The most obvious example, flooding in big seas, is a given, but a less obvious danger is cigarettes. Discarded butts from above had a habit of being sucked inside by open and unattended portholes, resulting in sudden fires that could doom a big liner. Passengers were forbidden, and they still are forbidden, to flick their cigarettes overboard for this exact reason. At night, stewards were tasked with shutting passenger portholes for the evening, and if big storms loomed ahead, the crew busily fitted deadlights and covers to any big exposed windows and sidelights across the ship. In Titanic's day, the Board of Trade mandated that portholes too close to the waterline either couldn't open at all, or that they could only be opened in port. The reason for this is very clear. When Britannic, serving as a hospital ship in 1916, struck a mine and began to sink, rows and rows of portholes left open to ventilate the wards suddenly met the ocean and sped the sinking up enormously. But portholes mainly presented passengers with sweet, sweet relief. Ships tasked with far-ranging voyages to Australia, Asia or the Mediterranean often provided staterooms and public rooms with scoops that could be fitted to the porthole and funnel fresh air into the room. Titanic and her sisters featured big, clever, utterly pivoting sidelights that did just this all by their own because they swung open by pivoting on a central axis, and the porthole's glass and frame itself scooped fresh air in by virtue of being angled outside of the hull. But portholes didn't just exist on the hulls of ships. Take Titanic for example again. On her forward A deck, there were 14 interior cabins which did not have portholes. Now, having no access to fresh air and natural light in a first-class stateroom would not have been an easy sell for the White Star Line. So, Titanic's builders, Harland and Wolff, came up with a clever solution. They installed portholes called skidlights at the level of the boat deck above. Now, from the outside, skidlights looked like traditional hinged portholes, but the magic in these skidlights happened on the other side. As Titanic moved along, light and air were directed via a shaft behind the skidlights down into the A-deck stateroom ceilings. A prismatic glass was fitted to better disperse light, and the system was concealed in the officers' quarters above. So while the White Star Line could not entirely replicate the feeling of having an actual cabin porthole, they were able to elevate the onboard experience of passengers in those cabins. Now, as the age of ships like Titanic passed and passenger ships like cruise ships got larger and larger, the actual use of portholes and their location completely changed. For example, Titanic had 2 decks as part of her superstructure, whereas the Oasis of the Seas today has 16 above the hull alone. The Oasis of the Seas does have some portholes, of course, but the simple matter of fact is that most passengers now live above the hull instead of inside it. These huge superstructures allow for modern-day cruise ships to include more cabins that feature open balconies. Balcony cabins can be sold at a premium, much like outboard cabins with portholes once did. Passenger shipbuilding today is down to a simple equation. Simply put, designers are tasked with the challenge of fitting as many balcony cabins as possible on an ocean-going hull. Despite how far shipbuilding has come, and how much the purpose of ships has changed, passengers are still looking for the same thing they always have: fresh air and sunshine. From cannons sporting doors to a breath of relief for cramped sailors, to outer space and everything in between, portholes have been serving their role and serving it well for hundreds of years. They're relatively small in comparison to other parts of the ship, but they've provided a large contribution to life at sea. I'll end on a fun little porthole-themed anecdote by a Reddit user called Tupperwolf that's been bouncing around my brain for about 10 years. The story goes that he, an officer, was sat eating in the wardroom of a US Navy warship when a real grump of an operations officer marched in and plonked himself down to eat breakfast. The problem was that sunlight was streaming in through a porthole right into the guy's eyes. So he picked up a phone, muttered a few orders, and slowly the sun began to move off his face. He'd ordered a slight course shift, and to quote Tupperwolf, he had literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people so that he could get the sun out of his eyes while he eats his bagel. For all their benefits, it would still seem that portholes just aren't for everyone. Cruise ships carry people. It's their whole reason for being. They feature unbelievably large, impressive galleys creating monstrous amounts of food. For example, the Queen Mary 2 will produce somewhere in the vicinity of 16,000 meals per day. Passengers will eat up to about 12 tons of beef, seafood and chicken, and 2 tons of potatoes in a single week. But all that food has got to go somewhere. And, as we all know, thanks to a helpful children's book by the same name, everyone poops. But at sea, where does all the sewage actually end up? Today, there's a popular misconception that cruise ships simply dump sewage overboard. But is that just a myth with no basis in reality? Does it go straight into the ocean, or is it stored on board? Is there another method? I'll let you on a little secret. The answer has nothing to do with the poop deck, but we'll talk about that a little later on. Today, we're going to explore and answer the question, what does happen to all that sewage aboard cruise ships? Every year, cruise ships are getting larger and larger. Today, the world's biggest ship, the Icon of the Seas, accommodates up to 7,600 passengers and 2,300 crew members per voyage. Each year, over 30 million passengers travel on cruise ships worldwide. That's a lot of bums on seats, if you know what I mean. And the logistical challenge of managing all of that waste produced during a cruise is immense. Each passenger generates a substantial amount of waste daily. In fact, an average cruise ship with 3,000 passengers and crew combined creates close to 21,000 gallons. That's nearly 80,000 litres of sewage per day. But because of strict regulations, it means that efficient and environmentally responsible sewage management systems are an absolute must on board. Now, this does create some serious challenges, but ones which clever engineering can account for. Back in Titanic's day, toileting at sea had gone through a series of evolutions. By the time Titanic set to sea, she featured hundreds of flushing toilets and urinals. In fact, many passengers from rural backgrounds had never even seen a flushing toilet before, and were used to just using holes in the ground. So early on, stewards on board ships like Olympic had a hard time explaining their use to steerage passengers who were actually just prone to simply finding a darkened corner in a corridor at night to do their business. Even before then, toileting had been simpler still. In the days of sailing, crew and passengers would use the heads, so named because their original location had been way forward at the ship's very front in the chains at the bow. Simple holes were cut into planking. It meant they could do their business right over the side. By the turn of the 20th century, flushing toilets weren't just a novelty, but a standard at sea. But despite the technological revolution they provided, the end result was the same as the simple heads of sailing ships. Sinks, showers and toilets drained or flushed through plumbing, which then ejected the contents right over the side of the ship through dozens of small engineering outlets cut into the side plating at the waterline. We have a nice romantic image of these ships like Titanic from back then, but the truth was they were sailing along, leaving a trail of waste behind as they went. Even worse, once docked in port, the overside discharge wouldn't stop, so swimming or fishing near large docks back then was an obvious no-no. The disposal of waste overboard on something as big as the ocean seems like a simple solution, but it does create some problems. Sewage pollution, particularly when untreated, poses serious health risks to both marine and human life. Marine life exposed to harmful pathogens and toxic chemicals can lead to infections, reproductive issues, and weakened immune systems in animals. Sewage in the ocean can also fuel algae blooms, in which algae grows out of control in a body of water, causing damage to marine life. For humans, exposure to contaminated water can also result in diseases such as cholera, gastroenteritis, particularly affecting those who consume tainted seafood or engage in water-related activities. Coastal communities are also at risk thanks to marine pollution, with long-term exposure increasing the risk of chronic health conditions. This wasn't so big an issue when sailing ships could carry 100 or maybe 200 passengers, but now, with ships carrying 5,000 or more, it obviously presents problems. The evolution of sewage handling on ships runs hand in hand with mainland waste management, and it actually wasn't until the late 20th century that real action and regulations were put into place to deal with it. The International Maritime Organization introduced the MARPOL Convention in 1973 to establish global standards for sewage treatment that limit pollutant levels and designate restricted discharge zones. So importantly, they added Annex 4 in 2003, which regulates sewage discharge from ships. The other annexes include managing oil, noxious and harmful substances in packaging, sewage, garbage, and air pollutants. The MARPOL Convention set a new course for environmental safety on the water. Under the convention, every ship 100 gross tons and over, and every ship certified to carry more than 15 people requires a garbage management plan. So with strict regulations in place, technology has quickly advanced, and modern-day cruise ships now have sophisticated sewage management systems that effectively handle and treat the onboard sewage. Now, these systems are designed not only to meet, but also often exceed the thorough international regulations outlined in the MARPOL Convention. These rules are enforced around the world through the flag and port states. That's the nation of the ships that are local or visiting. So flag states are responsible for ensuring that ships flying their flag comply with MARPOL requirements, while port states have the authority to inspect visiting ships and ensure that they are also in compliance with MARPOL regulations. Whew, now with that interesting background context and information out of the way, how actually does it work physically on board the cruise ships? The sewage treatment process begins at collection points, where black water, which is from toilets and medical facilities, and grey water from sinks, showers, laundries, and kitchens are divided into separate holding tanks within the ship's hull. Now, both black water and grey water pass through filtration systems to remove any solids and particles. The black water then goes through a biological treatment using aerobic bacteria to break down organic matter and reduce the pathogens. Grey water doesn't go through this process because the special bacteria that do all the biological work can be harmed and killed by chemicals found in soaps and shampoos. Both the grey and black water then meet again in the final sterilisation tank, which uses ultraviolet light, the most environmentally friendly sterilisation option, compared to things like chlorine or other chemicals. The treated water is then subjected to rigorous testing and analysis for bacterial content to make sure it complies for discharge. So if any microorganisms are still present, then the water goes through the whole treatment cycle again. If the water actually passes testing, then it can be discharged over the side and into the ocean. Surprisingly, the treated water discharged into the ocean from ships is often cleaner than the surrounding seawater that it enters. MARPOL also has rules regarding when and where a ship can actually discharge its waste. The general rule is that a ship needs to be further than at least 12 nautical miles from the nearest point of land. So the ship also needs to be in motion at a minimum speed of 4 knots, and the treated water to be discharged from its holding tank has to come out at a moderate rate. There are some designated bodies of water which are deemed special areas under MARPOL, and stricter rules apply. Places like Alaska, the Baltic, Mediterranean seas, they all fall under these special rules. Cruise ships have more than just sewage and grey water to consider when it comes to tackling waste management on board. They also need to consider the huge amount of solid waste that are created during the voyage. Things like food scraps, plastic bags, packaging, they all have their own processes. The regulations require ships to limit disposal at sea, instead managing waste through onboard storage, sorting, and then proper disposal at port facilities. Bilge and ballast water also need to be maintained. They have their own special treatment systems and plans on board where oil and pathogens are separated, removed from the water before being treated, and approved for discharge into the ocean. Now, despite all the technological advancements, waste management still remains a very contentious issue in the cruise industry. Environmental organisations and advocacy groups continue to fight for stricter enforcement of regulations and greater transparency when reporting incidents. Now, regardless of the strict rules still in place, the challenge of waste management on the high seas is a process that costs time and money. There have been some famous cases of big cruise companies being caught red-handed attempting to work around the system. Cruise operators like Carnival and Royal Caribbean have both faced major legal and financial repercussions for this. More recently, in 2016, Princess Cruises paid the largest ever criminal penalty for the illegal dumping of waste. They agreed to an eye-watering plea deal and were fined over $50 million. But what about cases where the waste management system on board the ship has actually failed and everything goes haywire? Well, look no further than the infamous voyage of the Carnival Triumph, more affectionately dubbed the Poop Cruise. In February 2013, the Triumph departed from Galveston, Texas for a 4-day cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. On February the 10th, a fire erupted in the ship's engine room, which disabled the ship's propulsion and knocked out the electrical systems, impacting air conditioning and, of course, toilets. For several days, the Carnival Triumph drifted without power and remained stranded until tugboats arrived to tow her to the nearest port. But as the days passed, conditions on board deteriorated rapidly. Passengers had to endure unbearable heat without air conditioning in the tropical climate. There was limited food and water supplies. But then, worst of all, many of the ship's toilet facilities began to overflow and seep throughout the ship. As if things couldn't get any worse, passengers were then asked to use red plastic hazardous waste bags to relieve themselves of solid waste and use their showers for, number ones. This caused oppressive discomfort and frustration for everybody involved, much of it which was documented at the time via passenger smartphones. After delivering a trip never to be forgotten, the cruise line eventually organised efforts to deliver supplies, implementing sanitation measures and evacuating passengers once the ship was towed to shore. To Carnival's credit, the passengers were eventually offered full refunds and other kinds of reimbursements. Individual lawsuits were also filed by passengers, leading to legal settlements and compensation for their memorable trip. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, there is one thing that we need to sort out, and that's the origins of the infamous poop deck. Well, despite what some popular opinion may think, the poop in the term poop deck actually originates from the French word for the stern of a ship, or la poupe. Now, this French word is derived from the Latin word pupus, which is one of 3 constellations that form the Greek constellation Argo Navis, representing the ship Jason and the Argonauts sailed in Greek mythology. Now, after all that, the word evolved over time and became the English word referring to the very stern deck of a ship, and, of course, the butt of many jokes. So there you have it. Behind the scenes on every cruise ship voyage, there is an intricate system in place to help keep our oceans clean. From primitive discharge practices to sophisticated treatment technologies, the journey has been marked by challenges, innovations, and will continue to improve. After all, at the end of the day, everybody's goal is to be able to enjoy these beautiful oceans that we get to call a part of our magnificent home. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.